So we're going to talk again about preparing people for diversity and equity from the perspective of practice. And I just want to say again, I'm so glad that there is really a focus on practice. I think that's really important. And we've just heard a whole lot about it from this excellent panel. I have been a teacher education practitioner the whole time that I have also been a teacher education scholar. I won't list all the activities I've participated in over the years, but there have been many. I taught my first group of student teachers and taught my first courses in teacher education in urban Philadelphia in 1978. I assure you I was way younger. So my job now is to give a conceptual framework for this question about what it takes to put equity at the center of teacher preparation. And what I'm going to do is provide a framework, and I think, as I just said, we've already heard so many good ideas and provocative questions. And so I think that what I'm going to offer does nothing more than kind of give a way to organize it, because many of the things that people have talked about fit, I think, with this framework. So my argument here is that if we want to put equity at the center of teacher preparation, we need to do 4 things. And I'm going to talk about each of them, but just to give you a quick overview. Am I talking too fast? Because I know you want to have lunch. Okay, I'm going to try to talk fast. That's all right? Okay. So the first one is to conceptualize in a general way the problem of educational inequality, and then what is the role of teacher education and teacher educators and teacher education policy in challenging this problem. The second one is to define the nature of practice for equity. What does practice look like in K-12 classrooms and in teacher education programs, and probably in policy as well? The third one is then to design and implement teacher education curriculum and program structures that are equity-centered. And the fourth one is to do research about equity-centered teacher education for 2 reasons. One is continuous improvement of the particular program. You heard a lot of talk about that just now. And also, hopefully, for this larger theory building that can be helpful beyond the local context. So, a little bit more on the first task. I think we probably all know that throughout the developed world, not just in the US, there are serious discrepancies and gaps between historically privileged and disadvantaged groups in terms of educational opportunities and in terms of educational outcomes. Some countries have much wider disparities than others, but every country in the developed world has disparities along these lines. Of course, the US has the very dubious distinction of one of the largest percentages of school children living in poverty among developed countries, which I think we should be highly ashamed about. There have been 2 approaches to an equity agenda in teacher education. One, where equity is pretty much synonymous with equality, which some people have called an equity as same or equal approach, and the other, a more critical socio-historical approach to equity. Here, the assumption is that equal or the same access to teachers and schools will produce equity, while here, the assumption is equal access alone won't produce equity because we also need changes in the systems and structures that produce inequity in the first place and then continue to reproduce inequity. The first idea is consistent with the idea of distributive justice that some of you are familiar with, sometimes called justice as redistribution of material goods and opportunities, while the second combines redistribution with the justice of recognition and the politics of identity. My colleagues and I in Project TIER that Karen mentioned in the introduction have called the first one thin equity and the second strong equity. Now, my argument, of course, is that in teacher education, as we are conceptualizing the problem, we need to work toward the goal of strong equity. But there's a tension here among two simultaneous goals, and everybody who's a teacher educator, I think, is familiar with this. Teacher education for equity is about preparing teachers to enhance the learning of students historically marginalized by the system. And at the same time, teacher preparation for equity is about preparing candidates who recognize and challenge the systems of inequality that reproduce inequity. This goal assumes that teachers make a difference. And if you're a teacher educator, of course you believe that. Why would we do this work? Why would this be our life's goal? But this one assumes that teachers alone can't eliminate inequity, and that teachers alone will never be able to do this solely by increasing the access of marginalized students to good teachers. So I think the challenge of the first task of putting equity at the center of teacher education is to figure out how to operate productively and constructively inside that tension, and to name that and to talk about it and to try to work on it. Second task, this is to define the nature of practice for equity. Now, I'm going to keep this very brief because I think this is one of the areas that people are very familiar with, and there are many, many ways to do this. Most importantly, across the varied work here, there's been a shift away from the idea of assuming that there are generic teaching strategies, skills, and techniques that are uniformly effective for all students in all contexts every time. And the move has been toward the recognition that teaching is content and situationally specific, and that it needs to build on the cultural, linguistic, and experiential resources of the students and their families and their communities. Now, lots and lots of researchers and practitioners have worked on these kinds of issues. That's why I'm going to say very little here. In terms of classroom pedagogy and practice, resulting in approaches, we've got a lot of things here that I think people know well. So we have ideas like culturally relevant pedagogy, drawing on communities' funds of knowledge, critical pedagogy, culturally sustaining pedagogy, realist urban pedagogy, authentic practice and achievement, and so on. This is more related to K-12 schools. But we also have teacher education pedagogy and practice with approaches such as community-centered teacher education, culturally responsive teacher education for linguistically diverse classrooms, teacher education for social justice, anti-racist teacher education, and so on. The third task is creating teacher education curriculum and program structures that are equity-centered, complex, and finely tuned to local context. So in short, this one has to do with what teacher education programs for equity look like. And we've actually just heard a lot about this from the panel members. For this task, I'm going to use examples from the 3 programs I've been most closely involved with over almost 40 years. And in your packet, I believe there is a reference list that's divided up by these 3 programs with articles that we have written and published over the years. So if you're interested in any of these 3 programs, you can find that list. There's also a handout in there with this diagram on it, which Karen, I think, is going to talk a little bit more about in a minute. So I want to use these 3 programs that I've been part of very quickly to focus on 3 of the central tasks of teacher education curriculum and programs. That's something about fieldwork, something about assessing teacher candidates, and something about coursework. Just to give you, I don't know, to prove that I have been a teacher educator and practitioner, not just a researcher. And I've been involved in many efforts over the years to reinvent and rethink teacher education curriculum. So I'm going to look, oh, this is a different slide from what I have it. Okay, I'm going to look at, I think we'll go right ahead to the next one. Okay, so I'm going to look at Project START, or Student Teachers as Researchers and Reformers, which is a program I founded and ran, and this existed for more than a decade at the University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia. And this was way before NCLB, so there was much more freedom in some ways, and yeah, a lot of more freedom in some ways. So what we did was to create a curriculum with teacher research for equity and justice at the center. We had teacher candidates working for a full year in the same class, and everybody in the program, cooperating teachers, university supervisors, and teacher candidates met together for a year every week in teacher research groups, and everybody was a learner and a researcher. That's all I'm going to say about it. I use the programs at the Lynch School of Education at Boston College to think about assessment of teacher candidates' performance. What we were trying to do was to keep equity and justice at the center of our program as we also assessed candidates' performance. So in order to do that, we revised the Massachusetts Candidate Assessment of Performance, or CAP. And for anybody who's from Massachusetts, you'll be very, very familiar with this because this is required. What we did was took the 4 standards that are required by the state as standards for teacher candidate performance, and then we added to them 2 more BC-specific standards, one on inquiry and one on teaching for social justice and equity. We developed psychometrically sound indicators for these new standards that were parallel to the kinds of indicators the Massachusetts CAP had, and we held our teacher candidates accountable to those standards in the same way that they were held accountable by us and by the state for these other standards. Finally, I'm using the M-Teaching program at the University of Auckland in New Zealand, where I've been an adjunct faculty member for 7 years, to say something about coursework. So some of you may know that New Zealand actually generally does really well on large-scale assessments in a general way. But what they've found over the years is that the good scores in the aggregate actually mask one of the biggest discrepancies between the achievement of high and low achieving students among all OECD countries who take these comparisons. So at Auckland, teacher educators revised all of their courses so that they were interdisciplinary, so that they focused on inquiry, and these are the names of some of their courses, and you can see that they don't sound like the usual courses that we found, and they did used to sound like that. So they revised everything so it was inquiry, equity, and justice, and they drew on the knowledge and experiences of the Maori, who are New Zealand's indigenous population, and who are disproportionately in the groups not performing well, and other islanders who also often tend to be in those groups. These are groups that have been traditionally minoritized and not well served by the system. Moving right along. So task 4 then is doing research on teacher education for equity. And again, we heard good examples of that from the panel. The idea here again is both to support improvement of the program and to build theory that can be useful beyond the local context. I'm going to use the same 3 programs quickly to give an example of the research. So with Penn's Project START, remember I'm focusing here on field work, we used weekly teacher research group meetings transcripts from 4 urban schools over a whole year to address our research questions about the learning opportunities that were created for teacher candidates when a program had inquiry and equity at the center and when people were in the same school, in the same class for a full year. We also looked at what opportunities the teacher candidates created for their students. And a lot of the work about this program was published in the mid to late 80s and into the 90s. So I'm proud of this work. It doesn't sound so radical now, but then it kind of was. So that was important, I think. Going to BC's program, in terms of assessment, one of the things that we did was to create a Learning to Teach for Social Justice belief scale and to embed this in a suite of teacher candidate and then graduate surveys. And we used that to explore research questions about how teacher candidates' beliefs changed over time, whether changes were maintained after graduation, and what the most challenging ideas about justice and equity were for the teacher candidates to understand and take up. And finally, with the M-Teaching program in New Zealand, remember I was looking here at coursework, we've been studying multiple cohorts of teacher candidates from the perspective of complexity theory, and this is the work that we're still working on right now, in order to address research questions about the ideas about practices for equity that teacher candidates come to understand and take up when their coursework is linked the way I just showed you, particularly what they call in New Zealand low decile schools, which are schools where the largest numbers of kids who live in poverty and who are low income attend, and they have 10 levels in New Zealand. Interestingly, unlike the US, the lower the decile, the more funding they get to help in terms of resources. We're also trying to understand what the conditions are from a complex perspective that prompt and sustain these understandings. So as I hope you could see, in all 3 of these programs, teacher educators work together to use the results of research to inform their programs, to make changes, and then to try to study those to inform themselves and more broadly. So I'm just going to make 2 very fast points in conclusion. So one point is really mostly related to task 4. Although a central purpose of our studies was to generate local knowledge, we were not trying to develop a model of teacher preparation for replication by others. In fact, we work from the assumption that narrow ideas about replication are inconsistent with the idea that initial teacher education and learning to teach is complex, and that it's characterized by co-evolving relationship between local schools and community partners, and that focusing on emergent rather than predetermined outcomes is important. And then finally, the second point is related. I really do believe that these 4 tasks are central, and maybe there's a 5th that somebody will come up with, but I think these 4 tasks are central to putting equity at the center of teacher education. I think the 4 tasks are broadly applicable across programs, but they're not generic, and there are no generic ways to accomplish them. The way these 4 tasks are accomplished are shaped by the place, the institutional goals and resources, local and larger politics and policies, particularly local histories and patterns of inequality, which are different in Auckland, New Zealand, from Boston or the North Country in New Hampshire. So I think as we take up these tasks, we need to remember that they're helpful, I hope, and as sort of general principles, but not that we would expect programs across to fulfill these tasks in the same ways. So hopefully this will be helpful, and I think you're going to explain what people are supposed to do with that.
Okay, maybe one quick round of applause.